I'm Randy May, of course, president of the Free State Foundation, and I want to welcome you to our 5th annual Telecom Policy Conference. You know, when I picked this date back in November, the day after spring, I envisioned a beautiful, warm day with cherry blossoms maybe blooming early and so forth, and little did I imagine they would be mentioning snow flurries in the weather forecast. In fact, some of you may remember when we first started the conference, initially I did it in January and February and had a lot of sleepless nights watching the weather forecast then. And I called it the Winter Telecom Policy Conference, and then last few years I moved it to March, not to have to worry. But anyway, it's nice and warm and cozy in here, and want to welcome everyone. And it's actually hard for me to believe that it's the 5th annual Telecom Policy Conference. I know that some of you in the room, I can tell by looking around, were with us at the first conference that I called an annual conference, and I remember saying almost these exact words, and you might too. I said, I know it's a bit bodacious to call this the first annual Telecom Policy Conference, but that's what I did, and so here we are at number 5. So as most of you know, although I've found out a couple of you don't, we had to do one switcheroo. Senator Rubio is now speaking at 1 o'clock, and he really wanted to be with us, which I appreciate very much, but had, due to a conflict, had to change his schedule, and I'm very thankful that Commissioner Pai, who's going to be joining me here in just a moment, was very accommodating in making this switch. Now, you have a program. I'm not going to take up a lot of time going over really the program because it's there, but for that switch I just mentioned. But in addition to the Commissioner Pai and Senator Rubio, we've got Blair Levin delivering closing remarks. We've got another FCC Commissioner, or actually soon to be FCC Commissioner, ex-FCC Commissioner, Rob McDowell, my colleague Debbie Tate, 2 former FCC chairs, Michael Powell and Dick Wiley on the program, a whole passel of senior industry executives and prominent academic experts. And they're all going to share their perspectives with us on the most important and controversial issues in communications policy today. And as always, you're going to have an opportunity to pose some questions as well during the sessions. Now, this year's overall conference theme is completing the transition to the digital world, how to finish the job and why it matters. And in a blog I posted on Monday, and I know every one of you don't read every blog that we send out, I pointed out that the FCC's National Broadband Plan, which is basically 3 years old this week, I think, since the release of it, that the FCC needed to, the plan recognized the FCC needed to act to ensure that the legacy POTS networks did not, quote, siphon investments away from new networks and services, close quote. So the plan recommended that the Commission initiate a proceeding, quote, to ensure that legacy regulations and services did not become a drag on the transition to a modern and efficient use of resources, close quote. And of course, as you know, AT&T filed a petition in November asking the Commission to initiate an IP transition proceeding to authorize tests to gather useful information concerning the best way to proceed with the transition, and the Commission commendably did initiate a proceeding. So we'll be talking about this IP transition proceeding some during the sessions, and of course, in one sense, the conference theme, completing the transition to a digital world, is intended to call to mind this proceeding. But in another important sense, I think the theme is intended to call to mind even larger more fundamental questions that ought to be considered in connection with this transition from analog to a digital environment. And as I noted in Monday's blog, here are at least a few of those, what I consider to be fundamental questions. Will Internet service providers in the digital broadband world remain free from legacy public utility style regulations that characterize narrowband service providers in the analog world, or will today's digital broadband services be subjected to public utility style regulation through the imposition of net neutrality style mandates or otherwise? Or the same question put more directly in a frame posited by Susan Crawford in her new book, Captive Audience. Will today's digital cable operators and other broadband operators be regulated under a, quote, utility model, those are her words, in the very same manner as electric utilities in the 19th century railroads? Or the same question put in another slightly different frame in light of a report just issued last week by a French government advisory panel recommending that net neutrality regulations be applied not only to Internet service providers, but also to search engines and social networks. So the question is, will net neutrality regulations in this country inevitably be extended to reach dominant search engines and social networks, especially in light of the fact that many of the pro-regulatory forces in this country look favorably upon European regulatory models? Another question is, in today's competitive broadband marketplace environment fostered by digital technologies, when consumers have an abundance of news, information, and entertainment choices, will cable, telephone, and satellite video providers finally enjoy the same First Amendment free speech rights as the print media, or will they continue to be treated as second-class citizens for First Amendment purposes? And then finally, in an environment in which spectrum constraints fueled by the ongoing exponential growth in wireless broadband usage for video and other high-bandwidth applications are widely acknowledged, will the Commission adopt more free market-oriented spectrum policies characterized by flexible use, unencumbered auctions, and the facilitation of secondary market transactions, or will the agency lean back on traditional command and control rules designed to micromanage these markets? Now, as we go through today's sessions, in the midst of all the nitty-gritty discussion that I'm sure we're going to have that necessarily help define the details and the trade-offs involved in policy making, I hope you'll join with me in keeping these larger, what I consider to be fundamental questions in mind. So with that, we are going to get started. I hope you've got on the tables the Twitter handle. Hope you'll feel free to tweet away when the basketball games come on. I hope you won't be watching basketball on your smartphones. We're going to have some monitors that might be walking around to make sure you're tweeting and not watching basketball. Now, I was told by one person, but hopefully none of you are having any problems, that on the for the Wi-Fi address that we had on this sheet of paper that's on the table, that for the network, for the auditorium address, that the correct code is AP, capital A, capital P, dash 1, or hyphen 1, hyphen 1. So hopefully, if you're not already on, if you use that code, that'll work. That's capital A, capital P, hyphen 1, hyphen 1. But don't forget, we have books on sale at a discount outside. The Free State Foundation's latest book, Communications Law and policy the next 5 years. Lots of good stuff in that book, but I don't want to do any more salesmanship now because I know you're anxious to get started. So with that, again, welcome. Thank you all for being here, and I'm going to ask Commissioner Pai to come up, and we're going to get started in our conversation.
Okay. Okay, both are already on and everything. Okay. Go Jayhawks. Is that coming through? No offense, Randy.
Well, you know, if you start doing that, then I'll have to start talking about Duke, and then Senator Rubio might start talking about the University of Miami, and, you know, we'll get to the really fun stuff. But thanks again for being here, and thanks
for having me.
Being accommodating and coming earlier. You know, I can say this is the largest crowd that we've had so far for our annual conferences. There may be 10 or 15 people here that still think you're Senator Rubio, but I think all the others know who you are, and you can see that you're a big draw. Now, I've always done this conversation as we had it scheduled after lunch on pretty much a full stomach, and so if I have a lean and hungry look here today, you'll understand why. And but nevertheless, even though I might be hungry, I'm still going to be, of course, nice, or sort of nice.
I'm glad to hear that.
Now,
thanks.
Now, just to put you at ease. Now, everyone's got the bios, and throughout the day, we're going to try and minimize a lot of bio talk and just give you the basics. And of course, with the Commissioner Pai, as you know, he's been on the commission as a commissioner now for just a little less than a year. He served in the General Counsel's office as Deputy General Counsel. In addition to other positions, he served in senior positions on the Hill as well, and in the Department of Justice. And in fact, and he clerked for a judge. So as he points out in his bio, he has the experience of working in all three branches of government. And we may gain some insights from that as we go along. So, Commissioner Pai, with that background, can you just, to get started, describe how your life experiences and the professional experiences that you've had shape how you approach your job as a commissioner?
Well, sure. First, let me start off by saying thank you very much for the invitation to come this morning. And it wasn't a problem to come earlier. I figured you were a devotee of the movie Spinal Tap, puppet show first and Spinal Tap second. So Senator Rubio definitely deserves prime billing.
You can see he's a lot younger than I am because I have no idea what he's talking about.
Yeah, these kids these days,
Go ahead.
But more generally, I want to thank you for all the work that the Free State Foundation does. You, former Commissioner Tate, Dan Lyons, Michelle Conley, Donna Gregg, so many others. I think are providing a really valuable contribution to the discourse about communications policy, and you deserve a lot of credit for that.
Thank you very much.
In terms of life experiences and professional experiences, I guess I should start with when I was born in 1973. No, I just I didn't want to start from the very beginning, but I did want to say that growing up in a small town in rural Kansas, In the 70s and 80s, when the communications landscape was very different, gave me a firsthand appreciation for the challenges of providing advanced services to all parts of the country, and also gave me appreciation for how far we've come. And I think so often we are so wrapped up in the newfangled technology of the day that we don't appreciate how far the marketplace has come. In terms of professional experiences, I think a number of the positions that I've held have given me a useful grounding for my work as a commissioner. So working in the antitrust division at the Department of Justice, for example, in the telecom section in the late 90s and early 2000s, which was one of the heydays of telecom mergers and acquisitions. It was in the wake of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. That gave me a really firm understanding of the dynamics of the marketplace, what the opportunities and challenges were from a regulatory perspective. Similarly, working in-house at Verizon, I was an in-house lawyer there for a little over 2 years, and I worked with a number of the business groups to try to help the company roll out quicker and better DSL service. And that's a difficult challenge for any business, but especially when you're working within a regulated entity, which has a number of legacy rules that it's very difficult to operate around sometimes. That gave me an understanding of the challenges from a business perspective. And some of the other positions I've held as well, working on Capitol Hill gave me an appreciation for the importance of working with Congress, congressional prerogatives, the need to make sure that they are kept in the loop when an administrative agency is contemplating a certain action. But there are any number of other positions I've held that played an important part as well.
Well, I'm glad we're doing this while you're as young as you are, because 10 years from now there'll be a lot more that I know you would even be able to recite. But thanks for that, and that tells the audience a good bit about where you're coming from and where you've been. Now, so we're going to talk a lot about the substance of some issues before the commission, but I want to start off by talking about the commission's process. Mm-hmm. and I mean, I've noticed since you've been a commissioner, you've spent a lot of time, done a lot of thinking, and talked about how the commission might reform its processes to make it operate more efficiently and effectively. And so, if you can do this and separate out these things without, yet talking about specific, items, I'd like for you just to name, say, two, we're going to try and limit this, name two ways that the commission could change the way it operates and its process to make it operate more effectively or efficiently, please.
It's a great question. I think from the perspective of process reform, I've taken the view, based in part on my years of service in the General Counsel's office, that the FCC needs to be as nimble as the industry that we oversee. And that's something I've heard a lot about from the private sector. It's something I take very seriously as a public official now. So a couple of things that we could do, which wouldn't require extra authority from Congress for us to be able to do. Number one, establish more deadlines. I think deadlines often focus the mind. It leads the commission to take action in a timely fashion. And where would we apply these deadlines? Well, let's adopt a 9-month deadline for acting on applications for review and petitions for reconsideration. Let's establish a 6-month deadline for acting upon waiver requests. Let's apply other deadlines. Transactional review should be completed within 180 days. I think the broader application of deadlines would help us act in a more alacritous fashion. Secondly, one of the ideas I proposed is that the FCC adopt something akin to the Supreme Court's certiorari process. And so under this proposal, if a party is aggrieved by a decision taken by one of the FCC's subordinate bureaus, and that party files an application for review with the full commission, this procedure would essentially allow the Bureau's decision to stand and would adopt the Bureau's decision as the Commission's own unless one commissioner asked for plenary consideration of that application for review, and within a certain period of time, say 90 days. I think that would be a tremendous way to reduce the backlog at the FCC. I've been struck by how many applications for review have been pending at the FCC for, in some cases, a number of years. And I think that's unfortunate as a matter of good government. It's also unfortunate for the parties to that proceeding to the extent that the law precludes them from seeking judicial review until the commission has acted. So they're sort of in this procedural limbo where they want a decision from the FCC, but they can't go to court to challenge the fact of a non-decision. So those are just two examples. I've talked about others that you only asked for two, but sunset clauses, just something as simple as creating an online dashboard that will allow the American public to see how the Commission has responded with respect to everything from license renewals to consumer complaints. Just the availability of that information, I think, would lead us to be acting with more dispatch.
Good. Well, I have to say for myself, Commissioner, I appreciate the focus you put on the FCC's processes. I was in the General Counsel's office, more than 3 decades ago, and obviously there's a lot that's changed at the Commission in positive ways. But to be honest about it, there's a lot of the way the Commission operates and the processes, and particularly going to things you've just talked about haven't changed. So I think it's good that you're thinking about those things.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. That actually came home to me, and sorry to interrupt, but last July we testified before the House of Representatives, and 2 representatives, one Republican from Georgia, one Democrat from Illinois, stayed around for a couple of hours just to ask us a question on behalf of one of their constituents. Each of them had been waiting for Commission action, in one case, since 1999. I mean, that's an incredible amount of time in any industry, but especially one as dynamic as the communications industry. So I'm hopeful that these bipartisan, or nonpartisan, frankly, proposals would find a widespread support throughout the public sector and the private sector.
Good. Most of the people in this room know this, but once in a while you see one of these dockets. You look at the docket number and it says 98 dash so and so or 96 dash so and so, and then it gives you an indication of how long these things have been going on. But when you see one, and there's still some of these around, I think, with the 5 digits, like 20896 or something like that, then you really know, those are pre pre 96. Okay, now let's move on. I want to ask you about your regulatory philosophy. At the Free State Foundation, we describe ourselves as being a free market oriented think tank, and that's a perspective that we have that guides our thinking. We're not abashed about it. We're proud that that's our perspective. So what I'd like for you to do is just describe, and again, at this point don't talk about specific proceedings really so much, but just describe your regulatory philosophy that you have, and if there's someone that you look to as a model regulator, then we'd be interested in knowing that, or if there's someone that's been particularly influential in shaping your own regulatory philosophy or perspective, you might want to share that with us as well.
Sure. It's a great question. I guess I would divide my answer into 3 parts. My regulatory philosophy, influences, and then I guess model regulators. In terms of regulatory philosophy, I don't really like to apply a label to myself. I sort of like the artist formerly known as Prince. I just don't apply sort of a one sentence or one phrase description of my regulatory philosophy. I think, however, in the 10 months or so that we've been in office, that people can look at the record and see any number of votes that I've cast, statements that I've issued, speeches that I've made, testimony that I've given on the Hill, interviews I've given to the press, and they can sort of discern, I think, where I'm coming from in a wide variety of industries. And where I'm coming from, I hope, is true to what I committed to doing during the confirmation process and on my first day in office, and that is to try to establish a regulatory framework that is going to create the maximum incentives for private investment and innovation. That's going to bring the benefits of competition to a full array of populations within the United States, which is going to continue to deliver cutting-edge services and products that are unrivaled throughout the world. And so I hope that the positions I've taken are leading to that kind of regulatory framework. In terms of influences, there have been any number of them. I think first and foremost of some of the economists whose work has had an impact on me. I graduated from the University of Chicago, so I'd be remiss if I didn't mention some of those economists. First and foremost, Ronald Coase, who still teaches at the University of Chicago Law School.
He's still teaching.
He does, yeah. And when I first encountered Coase's theorem, it was such a simple but profound thing for me. I mean, just the notion that if transaction costs are low, then bargaining should lead to efficient outcomes, regardless of the initial allocation of a property right. I mean, that's a very simple concept that has tremendous application in what we do, whether it's the secondary market for spectrum, whether it's the allocation of broadcast licenses, what have you. There have been many others too, too numerous to mention, but he would be one of the foremost.
Okay.
In terms of model regulators, it's hard to pin down anyone in particular, but I guess I should start by mentioning my soon-to-be former colleague, Commissioner McDowell. He has been a great advocate on behalf of free markets. He has taken a very principled and judicious approach to the work that he's done, and when necessary, he's raised the alarm about everything from threats to internet freedom from abroad to the need for the Commission to more narrowly tailor its transactional review. And so I think he's served as a good example for us.
Okay. Good. Okay, well, Commissioner McDowell, if he hasn't decided to head south earlier or whatever, he's going to show up here for the next panel, so you'll be able to give him another round of applause. But so that was helpful. But I just want to tell you, we're never going to be known as the think tank formerly known as the Free State Foundation. Okay, not going to happen. Now, okay, from there, let's move. I think to the next logical question. I think there's logic to all this. Can you describe how you assess? You're confronted with this issue, every day. Describe how you assess whether a market is competitive or not competitive, and or to put it another way, but it's the same question, I think. How do you assess whether there's a market failure? Because presumably, I think we know, based on what you've said, that if there's not a market failure, or if a market is competitive, then you're less, without getting into the details of a regulatory, you're less inclined to regulate, or more inclined if there's not. Tell us how do you look at a market and decide?
That's a great question. I think it's probably the question to some extent for all of us at the FCC. We don't operate with omniscience, of course. I mean, we can only know what facts we were able to glean from the marketplace itself. And so I think that we have to have an intellectual curiosity and a little bit of regulatory humility as we try to understand the market. And so that would suggest to me that we take a very open-minded, holistic view of what competition means. I think there's no single metric that can give you a binary answer, yes or no, as to whether there's a competitive market. I think we have to look at all the inputs and all the outputs. And I think two of the failures that regulators often succumb to is, number one, in this industry in particular, they don't recognize how dynamic the industry is. They look at a snapshot of the market at a moment in time, and the assumption often is, well, if it's this way today, it's got to be this way tomorrow, and so we should regulate on that basis. As you know, that's certainly not the case, given consumer patterns in this industry. Secondly, I think we also have to be aware that there are any number of substitutes now that weren't even contemplated years ago. And by this I mean not just intramodal competition, which I think was the presumption underlying the Telecommunications Act of 1996. The presumption now should be intermodal competition. So it's not just ILECs and CLECs battling it out to provide voice service. It's cable companies, satellite companies, wireless companies, and over-the-top providers now competing in that same space. And so I think in an era where convergence is the norm rather than the exception, we have to take a very broad view of the substitutes in a given product market.
Okay. I noticed, Commissioner Pai, in one of your recent speeches, I think in the past week or so, you quoted that famous economist Yogi Berra, I think, and to the effect that when you come to a fork in the road, take it. I think, meaning you've got to make a decision, sometimes. But another one of his sayings that I think has some applicability to what we're talking about and what you just said. He said, "You can observe a lot just by watching," and I think that's true of some of these markets. I don't want to take your place, but I've thought of that often when the Commission doesn't. There are 33% of households, I guess, or people that have disconnected their landlines and yet you rely on their mobile phones, and yet the Commission, for a lot of purposes, doesn't count that as competition. And I think of old Yogi. You could observe a lot just by watching. But anyway,
I'll steal that sometime for a statement.
Okay. Now, so this week, or I guess just a couple of days ago, the Commission had a workshop on the Technology Transitions Policy Task Force. And at that workshop, Commissioner Janikowski said, I think I'm quoting both my friends at TR Daily and Com Daily. I wasn't there, but I'm sure that it was accurate. That, quote, while some like to refer to the competitive all IP world as if competition and IP are synonyms, we know that's not true. We need to take a more sophisticated, data-driven approach to determine which policies to keep for today's markets, which to add or modify, and which to eliminate. Now, and you said, or your statement, I guess, that you released in connection with the workshop, you said the Commission needs, quote, to make clear that obsolete 20th century economic regulation will not be imported into the IP world, close quote, and it should do so by repealing, quote, the obsolete rules that were designed for the networks of yesteryear to combat discrete market failures and anti-competitive harms. Now, of course, in one sense, if you read these two statements, they're not really necessarily in conflict, but there does seem to be a difference in emphasis when you listen to what was said. And sometimes going back to our friend Yogi, when someone talks about sophisticated, data-driven models, it's to some extent it's in the eyes of the beholder. But what this whole question of the IP transition is what I'm going to be talking about throughout the day, and it's obviously the theme of the conference in the larger sense. But tell me how the difference you think between how Commissioner Janikowski approaches assessing market competition, because you've observed by watching now for a long time, and yourself, and this difference that I discern from these two statements.
Sure. Well, I think my own approach is that it is indisputable that the laws that apply to the telecommunications sector in particular were created at a time when you had radically different infrastructure, business models, and consumer demand patterns. Things have changed so fundamentally so quickly that I think it's difficult for us to appreciate, unless you look at the numbers, how substantially they've changed. So for example, it used to be the norm for decades, almost a century, that if you wanted to make a call, your solution was to find plain old telephone service delivered over the public switched telephone network. There were 197 million such subscriptions just a decade ago. Now that number has dropped substantially by 40%, and only a third of U.S. households now subscribe to POTS, as it's known, over the PSTN, and that number is dropping every single day. Meanwhile, the number of VoIP subscriptions is rising every single day. It's 37 million in 2011, and I would expect that number to climb. All of that is because of the transition to IP, from TDM-based services to IP services, from circuit-switched services to packet-switched services, from copper to fiber. And regardless of how one might subjectively characterize competition in this marketplace, it's indisputable that it's more competitive than it once was. I mean, you have competitive entry now from all sorts of different providers who heretofore were operating in completely different silos in terms of the regulatory treatment under the Communications Act. And so I prefer to see this glass is half full, that we have more competition than we've ever had before. And that's due in part to the fact that we have an IP-based system that doesn't rely on copper wires dominated by monopoly providers, but rather IP networks that are frankly indifferent as to the identity of the provider, as to the very service that is being provided over those networks. I mean, an IP network doesn't care whether it's a voice communication or a video application. it's all just data traveling over the internet. And so that, I think, is a good thing. And for that reason, that's why I said that I don't think we should import some of the broken, obsolete legacy regulations that presume that we're still in the world of old.
Okay. I mean, you've alluded to some of this, but I want to focus more specifically now on competition in the broadband marketplace and how people look at it differently, which we've been leading up to. Have you read Susan Crawford's book, Captive Audience?
I've not, no.
Okay, well, that's not going to get you off the hook, because I'm going to tell you, I'm going to tell you sort of the central thesis, so you just can accept it as true, and then I want to see what you think about it. Because I have read the book, and so Susan concludes that cable operators primarily, and I think other broadband providers as well also would fall into this category for this purpose, should be regulated, as I said earlier, under what she calls a utility model, and she refers to the way electric utilities are regulated. And so everyone here in the audience is familiar with, the old public utility type of regulation. You look at, you basically regulate the rates, and there's a non-discrimination standard. And you have rate proceedings and cost. You look at the cost and all of that stuff. Now, and she says that, and especially focusing on cable, because she says that cable broadband service is in, now a pretty much unbeatable position, and that the bulk of new wireline internet subscriptions are going to cable, and that wireless broadband is an entirely separate market that's not part of that market. And by the way, when you look at the actual footnotes, that are supporting what I've just said, she then defines the broadband market for her purposes as the, quote, very high-speed market, close quote, which refers to 100 megabit service or above. And so that's her thesis, and it's gotten some play in the press and so forth. How do you respond to her perspective?
Well, I guess I would draw upon my statement in connection with the 706 report last year that, once again, this is a glass that is half full, that there is a good story to tell about the broadband marketplace, and the story is that marketplace is competitive. I think generally the vast majority of Americans now can choose from among a number of different providers. And if you look at some of the different metrics, I think it's indisputable that there's more competition now than there was before. You have telecommunications carriers upgrading their DSL service with IP-enabled technologies and fiber. You have cable companies that are spending billions of dollars to upgrade to DOCSIS 3.0 equipment that allows them to increase their capacity tenfold. You have satellite companies that are offering people, even in rural areas, 12 megabits per second service. Those are speeds that people never contemplated in some of those places. And wireless too. I mean, I think you have wireless broadband offerings now that, as you suggested in your opening statement, are going to allow some people in this room potentially to watch the NCAA tournament over a wireless device. And I have to think that the vast panoply of companies in these different sectors would not be spending that money, would not be offering such services, if indeed there was some sort of unbreakable bottleneck that was held by one segment of the industry. It's just not rational behavior.
Okay. Boy, I wish we had all morning. I'm going to ask 2 or 3 more questions, then we're going to get maybe a couple questions from the audience. We have to move on, but I may have to get you back next year for part 2, and we'll see where things stand. But this is terrific. So let me ask you this about the IP transition again. You gave a talk recently. You laid out, I think, your 4 principles that should govern the test. Participation in the pilot program should be voluntary. Tests should be conducted in a variety of places to represent diverse geography, and residential customers should continue to have voice service available to them, even if that service is based on IP, and the pilot test must be able to be evaluated to determine what worked and what didn't. That last one seems pretty important. So, so I just want to ask you quickly, so what are the couple pieces of information really that you're looking for that are going to be helpful to you in determining how to move forward if you've been able to think about that at this point?
Well, piggybacking off the fourth principle, which is arguably the most important, conducting the all-IP pilot program is useful in itself, but it's not going to be tremendously useful if we aren't able to evaluate what the results are. There aren't any particular results that I'm looking for other than to see what goes right and what goes wrong when you migrate some of your customers from a TDM platform to an all-IP platform. Are there service disruptions? Does the network not operate as efficiently as one might have thought in an all-IP environment? I think we need to figure those things out, and so I come to the enterprise with a completely open mind. I don't have any preconceived views of what's going to work and what's not going to work, what regulations we should keep and what we should jettison, other than the broad brush pictures with respect to economic and social regulation. So I don't mean to dodge the question except to say that I don't have any specific thresholds or markers in mind that are going to yield a success or a failure in terms of the pilot program.
Okay. Let's talk for just a moment about the spectrum auctions that are coming up, and we're going to have a panel after lunch on spectrum policy and spectrum auctions to delve into it in more detail. But in your recent Senate testimony, you said in that testimony, and I think I'm quoting, that there were storm clouds on the horizon. And you said you worry that the Commission might limit auction participation by excluding some who would want to participate. Well, who on the Commission would want to do that, and why would they want to do it?
Well, I don't want to speak for my colleagues, but I think if you look at the record, you will find suggestions that the FCC limit participation in both the forward auction and the reverse auction. And I think to some extent it's unsurprising that you would hear those calls. I mean, for example, with respect to the forward auction, if the FCC artificially limits who can participate, then those who are allowed to participate can obtain spectrum at a lower price. Similarly, in terms of the reverse auction, some people have suggested that we limit the amount that broadcasters are allowed to bid. And I suppose I could understand that as a means of lowering the overall cost of the auction, but I fear that that move would backfire because broadcasters might well be deterred from coming to the table in the first place. My own position, as I expressed in the testimony, is that I want the broadcast incentive auction to be a success, and that means that we need to give maximal incentives to both broadcasters and wireless companies to come to the table, and we can't do that if we limit who can participate. And I should add, by the way, that it's important for us for the incentive auction to be a success in part because Congress has directed us in the Spectrum Act that they passed last year to use some of the proceeds from the incentive auction to fund national priorities like FirstNet, like Next Generation 911 implementation, like deficit reduction. And so we can't do those things if we don't have an eye on maximizing net revenues. And so I think it's all the more important for us to make sure that we structure the auction in such a way that everyone feels welcome at the party, so to speak.
Okay. And just talk briefly, if you would, and I think your testimony mentioned this as well, the trade-off between unlicensed and licensed spectrum. I know there are controversies that surround that, but just tell us how you think about approaching the decision about, how much for one side or the other.
Is it with respect to, say, federal spectrum or 5 gigahertz or auctions? Or?
Any of it. I'm going to give you a free response before I ask you the really tough question at the end.
Great. Well, I think that look, any sensible spectrum strategy is going to have to incorporate both unlicensed and licensed elements. I think that there's no question that unlicensed innovation has brought tremendous benefits to the American consumers, and Wi-Fi is the most prominent example of that. There's Bluetooth and any number of other unlicensed innovations. At the same time, I think it's important for us to focus on the benefits that licensed spectrum has delivered. And I think that auctioning free and clear spectrum is often the best thing for consumers because it gives licensees the most flexibility and the strongest incentive to put that spectrum to the highest valued use. And so I think that my general preference with respect to particular bands especially is going to be for licensed auctioned approach. We have to take into account, of course, the band in question. So when it comes to 5 gigahertz, for example, I've been very bullish on the possibilities for unlicensed use there, where you can create super wide channels up to 195 megahertz. The propagation characteristics of that spectrum are ideally suited for unlicensed applications like Wi-Fi. And ideally, we would be able to coordinate with NTIA and, to make sure that federal users are on the same page. So consistent with all the above approach to spectrum policy, I think that both have an important part to play.
Okay. I'm going to ask Commissioner Pai one more question in one more area, and then we only have time for 1 or 2 questions. So if you have one, think of it, but you have to wait and be recognized if you have a question. So the last area that I'd like to ask you about is forbearance reform. And just to put it bluntly, Commissioner, it seemed to me, as someone who watched the commission, was involved with the commission before the 1996 Act, and then saw the forbearance provision included in the Act and understood how the market was changing, the dynamics were changing. It always seemed to me that was a provision that I would even say Congress intended to be used more and could have been used more. And I understand that there may be different opinions, but frankly, it's been disappointing to me that the Commission hasn't availed itself of that. So I want to just ask you about it. And I know you gave a speech recently in which you devoted some attention to forbearance reform, and I thought that was terrific. And your focus, I think, sort of going back to where we started, was on sort of the process of the forbearance process mostly, and you specifically suggested the Commission should have a deadline again, and it shouldn't. All of these things shouldn't be decided, at the last minute with 15 months, just because the Commission has that much time. And you and I are on an agreement in that. But it seems like, that maybe the reform, in my view, should go even further. And I just want to see what you think about it. In terms of the forbearance process. I've suggested that Congress could, and I understand this would take congressional action, and that you're not Congress, but I've suggested the statute could be amended, the forbearance provision, and by the way, the regulatory review provision that's associated with it, the periodic regulatory review, so that it would establish a presumption, in the statute that, absent clear and convincing evidence to the contrary, that the statutory criteria that govern the evaluation of whether a petition should be granted, that they would be deemed met. So in other words, the criteria themselves would not be changed, but there would just be this evidentiary presumption that presumably would change the outcome of the Commission's decision making, at least in cases in which, justifiably there ought to be relief granted. What do you think about a change like that in terms of actually affecting the way a lot of these legacy regulations are able to be, that are no longer justified, are able to be eliminated?
It's an interesting proposal. I guess I approach the task of adjudicating forbearance petitions based upon my view of the competitive marketplace. And as we've discussed earlier, there's no question that the telecommunications marketplace in particular has undergone revolutionary change, and it's much more competitive than it ever has been. And so that would suggest to me that the FCC should indeed be more liberal, so to speak, in terms of its application of forbearance authority and its exercise of biennial review authority as well.
Even without a statutory change, of course. It's what you're saying.
Right, and we have existing authority to do that. And I would put in a pitch, by the way, for the importance of the FCC acting more quickly, because I think it would have a competitive impact. For example, the recent forbearance petition, which we granted in part, it took us a year to do, and in my view, it shouldn't take a year for the FCC to decide that, in this case, certain regulations that were applied by the Telegraph Division back in 1936 are outmoded. I mean, that's sort of a no-brainer that I think was unopposed in the record, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I think we could move a little quicker and be more true to the statute in terms of deadline. But going to your question in terms of the evidentiary presumption, I'd have to think about how that would play out in different rules, or with respect to different rules. But I think it's an interesting idea that deserves some consideration, because I think that the FCC, as I said, should be more proactive in its use of forbearance authority, because, as you know, under the statute, we don't have to sit passively and wait for petitions to come to us, and we can act sua sponte,
right.
In this area. So,
right. I don't think the Commission's been overworked really in terms of acting sua sponte and granting forbearance petitions. But yeah, my point, and I appreciate your thinking about it, is, and this could actually, in my view, be applied more broadly when, if and when there's a Communications Act rewrite. It just seems like, in taking note of the marketplace changes and the changes in the environment, that, and I think there are other frameworks like this, there could just be a presumption applied, not that it's not rebuttable, but that it could be applied. So,
right.
So I appreciate that.
And I think, oh, sorry,
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say as well, I wanted to put in a pitch for another proposal I recently made, which was to extend that provision of Section 10 to Title VI, to have something like forbearance from MVPD regulation, because I think that forbearance, while it hasn't been used as as much as it should have been, I think nonetheless has been a useful tool for the FCC to adopt a deregulatory approach. And so I think if we had similar flexibility with respect to Title VI, that could really benefit consumers.
No, exactly. And I should clarify too, or I'll get my email box will fill up. When I put out that proposal that I referred to a few years ago, I actually said that in any congressional revision that the forbearance authority ought to apply to, it seems to me, almost any regulated entity. I mean, the cable operators too, but anyone that's regulated by the Commission. Okay, now what we're going to do, I'm going to see whether there are questions, but just so you'll know, once Commissioner Pai and I finish up here shortly, we're going to start our panel very soon after that. We're going to remove these chairs that we're sitting on. There's a table behind us. We're going to get that set up for the rest of the day for the panels. That's only going to take 3 or 4 minutes, so you might be able to get a cup of coffee back there or whatever, but then we're going to get started with the panels as soon as this is over. Okay, so first question, I see Mr. Spiewak there. I'm going to recognize him.
Hi, Larry Spiewak, the Phoenix Center. Great conference, Randy. Thank you. Commissioner, I have, I won't bring up my discussion on the Phoenix forbearance order, so if you want to talk about that. I have a second legal, factual, good government question for you. The FCC during this administration has constantly found that broadband is not being deployed on a reasonable and timely basis under Section 706. To make that determination, they have deliberately ignored a study performed as part of the National Broadband Plan, which says, well, it costs $50,000 per home for the most expensive homes, and that's unreasonable, and let's use satellite. Well, about a month ago, the FCC in their Measuring Broadband report came out and said, guess what? Satellite's great, the latency's gone, and now we have 2 service providers providing it. So my question is broadband deployed on a reasonable and timely basis, and therefore does the factual underpinning of much of the FCC's agenda now fall?
Well, as I made brief reference to my separate statement on the 706 report last year, and what struck me in that exercise is that, to go back to a movie reference, some of my colleagues and some people within the industry often take the cool hand Luke approach. What we have here is a failure to communicate. But I think the broader story of broadband deployment in this country has been a success. I mean, under the terms of the statute, we are charged, as you know, with determining whether advanced telecommunications capability is being deployed in a timely and reasonable manner. There's no question that that's happening. I mean, you see capital expenditures on the wireline side in the tens of billions. As I said earlier, you have cable companies spending a tremendous amount of money to upgrade to DOCSIS 3.0. You have satellite and wireless providers, as you pointed out, spending a lot of money as well to upgrade their networks. I mean, in the case of wireless, the transition to 4G LTE isn't a costless one. And so the fact that all these companies are making such massive capital expenditures to upgrade their networks to provide broadband suggests to me that the market is becoming increasingly competitive, because those capital expenditures wouldn't have any reason to exist unless companies thought there was going to be a return on the investment, that they'd be able to offer competitive services that would provide consumers, better, faster, cheaper broadband. And so, I think this is one of the success stories, frankly, in the communications landscape that we should be proud of, and we shouldn't, downplay things, downplay the state of competition, for the sake of, either political convenience or an excuse to adopt some of the 706 enhanced authorities for the Commission to regulate.
Okay, if we have one more question, I'll take it. If it doesn't have 3 or 4 subparts to it. Does anyone else have a question? Matt Schwartz. Just, yes, you do, and identify yourself for that. We're transcribing these proceedings.
Hi, my name is Matthew Schwartz from Communications Daily. You said today that one of the reasons we seem to have more competition than ever is because IP networks are indifferent to who owns the network or what kind of data it's carrying. That seems to me like kind of an endorsement of the open internet rules. My question for you is, if you were on the Commission at the time, would you have voted for the open internet rules? And if not, how can we ensure that IP networks continue to remain indifferent to who owns the network or what kind of data it's carrying?
Well, just to be clear, when I talked about indifference, what I meant was that in the old world of copper, you had a communication that traveled from point A to point B, and its only route of traveling was over that copper line owned by a monopoly provider. But in the IP context, I mean, the sender host and the destination host are the only defined points that we know the packet is going to travel over. And so because of the Internet Protocol, the packet could travel any number of ways to reach its destination. The network is indifferent as to who owns the network, which network it's traveling over, and it's indifferent as to the content of the packet. It's just trying to route the packet in the most efficient way. So that's what I had in mind when I talked about indifference. But as to your particular question about the net neutrality rules, I take the general view that the net neutrality rules were a solution, in search of a problem, and had I been on the Commission in 2010, I wouldn't have supported them, in part for that reason, in part because I have serious questions about the Commission's legal authority to adopt them. And we'll find out, of course, later this year, or perhaps next, what the D.C. Circuit thinks of those rules as well.
Okay, well, Commissioner, I'm going to give you one more Yogi Berra quote. You probably didn't know when you inserted that in your speech that you had another. There was someone else out there that had a bunch of Yogi Berra quotes, but he said predictions are tough if they involve the future. So that may be true, but I think one prediction that's not tough is that you are going to continue to do very important work at the Commission, do it very well, continue to be a very important voice, I think, for free market-oriented policies and for basically just sound communications policy. So that's a prediction that I feel comfortable in making. And I want to thank you for being here today. Hopefully you'll be back at future FSF conferences. And I'd like for everyone to join with me in thanking Commissioner Pai.
Oh, thanks. Thanks.